thank you for joining me on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. I'll get into the next segment, but before I get into all the details of what's coming out of the NFL coaches meeting and all the quotes and interesting rumors and topics that could gain some traction going forward, again, I want to remind you guys for the last time on today's show, if you have any questions or comments, to please use the tip and donations link, which is GSMCPodcast.net. It makes the show a lot more fun, and by using that link, I'm able to see your question pop up right away in the chat box to my right. I'm able to engage with you guys and make this show a lot more conversational. It's a big help for the show, as well as all the shows across the network. We always appreciate it anytime anyone's able to do that for anyone on the show. But like I mentioned, what's being talked about at the NFL coaches meeting, a lot has been said from these coaches and owners somewhat as well, with all the interviews and media availability that they've had to do. They've been asked a ton of questions, and some of the biggest ones were around Mike Tomlin and the Steelers and Jim Harbaugh, the Jets, what their plan is as well. Mike McDaniel's had something to say. And I want to start it off by talking about, Jim Harbaugh. He's had a lot of funny quotes, and he's kept it very lighthearted, which is good to see because a lot of times I think these meetings and these media availabilities can get pretty serious with some of the questions and how the coaches interpret it. But he's brought a lot more lighthearted mood and has been very open and has cracked a few jokes here and there with everyone. But one of the biggest things that I found interesting was that how he mentioned 4 quarterbacks could go in the top 4 before they even pick at 5. And he worded it as, he basically has the first pick of the draft almost after the quarterbacks go, top 4, like he says he anticipates. And, I never really thought of it that way, and it's very possible that it does happen. At that point, like I mentioned before, do you take best player available, or because there's an abundance of players, do you trade back just a few trade picks and get more capital and still improve this offense like I hope that they do, because they have no offensive firepower right now? That's an option, but the way that he worded it, it made me think like, wow, like that's actually true. 4 quarterbacks could go, and he could have the pick at anybody that he really wants, because he obviously doesn't need a quarterback. I thought that was really interesting how he said it. The next biggest one is Mike Tomlin, like I mentioned. He worded the competition at quarterback as, Russell Wilson right now stands in the pole position. Those are his words, how he phrased it, right now to be the starter. He also mentioned how Justin Fields oozes talent and that he can't wait to try and extract all that talent. He will have a chance to compete in preseason as well as in training camp. That is typical Mike Tomlin. A lot of good phrases and answers to these questions, but he never really said starter. Russell Wilson is the starter until he's not. He said he's in the pole position, which I interpret as, he sits based on what he has done and what he has shown everybody to be ahead of Justin Fields in being the starter, if that makes sense. He gets a head start in the race, and the finish line is obviously being that starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The way that pole position and how I interpreted it as was that he starts 50 meters ahead of Justin Fields in the 400-meter race. To use an analogy, he has had more success with the Seahawks, obviously. He's won a Super Bowl. He's more established longevity-wise than Justin Fields. So he is in the pole position, obviously, like Mike Tomlin said, to potentially be the starter. I think not saying that he's the starter unquestionably right now, I think says a lot. He's leaving the door open, and I don't think Justin Fields is that far behind, in all honesty, just because of that potential that sits there with him and all the talent that surrounds him now. It is exciting to see, but that's something that you can pick out of this by reading between the lines. Not him saying that he's not the starter, I interpreted it that way, and I think it's fair to say that it's a lot closer than most people think. Another thing that kind of relates to free agency now is Mike McDaniel's talking about Odell Beckham Jr. I mentioned in a YouTube short that he was meeting with the Miami Dolphins just last week, and nothing really came about that. Nothing has been made official where OBJ is signing, but Mike Daniels did clear it up and said that they actually made an offer to Odell, but he said in his words that business takes time. There's obviously a bunch more suitors out there for Odell Beckham because he is one of the top remaining free agents. I just think that he fits the best with the Miami Dolphins, in my opinion. You got two young wide receivers outside of Odell to really free him up and give him the space that he needs to add to that offense whatever he can. In Baltimore, I think he wasn't that much better than Rashad Bateman or Zay Flowers because of how young they are, not really established. So I think he was looked upon to do more, and I just don't think he's at the point of his career to provide that much more. So now with Waddle, who requires a lot of targets, who'll take up a lot of yards, and looks from Tua, Tyreek Hill obviously goes without saying. I think those two guys are perfect for Odell to just go in there, give whatever he can, and it's not going to hurt the team by him not producing. It's not going to take away from this offense, which was amazing last year. So there's that. Gerard Mayo also touched on their number 3 pick, kept keeping the options open. He said he's open to a trade. In his words, he said the quarterback is a priority, not a certainty. He's ready to start Jacoby Brissett if he needs to, which is what I expected when I talked about it before. I suggested that it was better to start Jacoby regardless of the quarterback, which I anticipate being there, and kind of bridge that gap with him. But it almost sounds like he could be ready to trade out of there and start Jacoby and still be in a position maybe next year to draft a younger guy. You could interpret it a lot of different ways, but keeping the door open there a little bit does leave room for the Minnesota Vikings to trade up. The Denver Broncos have made suggestions that they could trade up. Those teams, the door hasn't been shut on them when it really could have, because there's 3 to 4 really good quarterbacks that are up there, and Gerard Mayo could have just said, yeah, we're going to draft one of them, and we're not moving because we need a quarterback. I think he's really analyzing this and realizing that this team is in need of a lot of things, so trading down would not be the worst thing in the world. Like I've been saying, Antonio Pierce said Aiden O'Connell has earned the right to compete at quarterback, which you could think isn't them giving up on trading up, but he will be fine with Aiden O'Connell starting. He wasn't awful. He had some decent games where he really used the term and utilized the term game manager. He didn't lose them the game. He didn't win them the game, but he was just all right. I think the Raiders could get by with that. Antonio Pierce seems to agree. So there was that. Robert Saleh and the Jets. Saleh said that Aaron Rodgers would be ready to start in the spring and get back to on-the-field stuff. And I thought it was pretty neat that he said that they were planning on making adjustments to their off-season programs to try and cut down on the injuries, which is smart, not only because they've had a lot of injuries in the past already, but because you're bringing in older guys that realistically won't give you as much as they could have before physically. So I like that Robert Saleh is realizing that and trying to make changes to these little nuances that a lot of people wouldn't really think of, but really make a big difference for these experienced veteran guys that the Jets have on their team, and just shows that they're really going all in with this group of older players to try and find success any way they can. And one of the last things is the replay assistant upstairs, the eye in the sky, if you will now be allowed to correct will be allowed to correct certain types of incorrect calls on the field for roughing the passer and intentional grounding. According to Tom Pelissero, those two are the biggest ones, and it's almost like I don't understand why the NFL hasn't really done this like the NBA. I know the game's already long enough, so you don't want to always stop it like the NBA. But these calls are pretty big. Intentional grounding and roughing the passer are always debated very intensely a lot in games that matter and decide games. I don't understand why they wouldn't review them anyway and why the eye in the sky already wouldn't be doing that. But apparently that's going to happen more often now. And the last thing I will say on what's coming out of the NFL owners meeting the last few days, again, revolves around the Jets. Joe Douglas touched on Zach Wilson. Nothing is really close to being done in terms of a trade for him, but, he's keeping the options open. It hasn't really gained that much traction thus far, which is crazy to see, in totality because of how high Zach Wilson was drafted and how young he is still. But, they're still open to it, but nothing's really come of that. And he talked about Jadeveon Clowney. He said that he had an outstanding meeting with him and spent an hour just getting to know him. It was a very productive meeting, but he didn't have any breaking news to give to all the media members on there that were looking for an answer. But, it seems positive. He has other suitors out there as well. But the Jets are very interested in Clowney because before, Shaq Barrett, who signed with the Miami Dolphins, said that he was very close to signing with the New York Jets. But when the Dolphins came calling, he decided to sign with them. So the Jets are obviously looking for a pass rusher. They like Clowney, but they understand that this is a process. This takes time. And it is positive for them in one aspect, but I think it will take some time because Clowney is looking for success now at this point in his career. So if he thinks it'll be with the Jets, I think it'll be a short-term deal, what he has been doing these last few years. But he is fortunate that this last season was very good for him and tying a lot of career highs for him. So he does have that leverage, but that for now rounds off the topics and quotes that have been coming out of the NFL owners meeting. A lot of interesting stuff there that can be interpreted and can be picked on a little bit to create more news, and I'm sure it will create a lot more news and stories, rumors going forward. But that's it for now on that segment. I'm going to send it to the last break of the show, and for the last topic, I'm going to break down the new kickoff rule and my reactions to it, how I feel about it, and how I think new scenarios can come off of this new rule coming to the NFL, specifically on the kickoff. So that last story is coming up after the break on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.